As the world's attention remains focused on the conflict in Ukraine, China has been moving to shore up its interests along its borders. It recently hosted a meeting with Afghanistan's 6 neighbors, giving a diplomatic boost to the country's Taliban rulers. But China also welcomed U.S. officials to a separate meeting, providing a rare chance for Beijing and Washington to discuss the future of a country the U.S. pulled out of chaotically last year. Hadia Alalavi reports.
China is emerging as a major player in Afghanistan's future. Last week, it held several multinational meetings, gathering humanitarian, economic and political support for a country facing a worsening humanitarian crisis. China's foreign minister said that Afghanistan's interim government should make concrete efforts towards gaining diplomatic recognition.
We have decided to provide substantive support to Afghanistan in key areas including humanitarian aid, connectivity, economy and trade, agricultural development, energy and electricity, and capacity building.
During a meeting with Pakistan and Afghanistan, Wong said the 3 countries can jointly build the Belt and Road Initiative, a multi-trillion-dollar infrastructure project, and extend the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor to Afghanistan, a separate transport plan worth over $50 billion. China also hosted a separate meeting called the Extended Troika, which included Pakistan as well as the US and Russia. It was a rare opportunity for the rivals to discuss the crisis in Afghanistan despite their differences over the ongoing conflict in Ukraine.
The 4 parties reiterated their firm support for the Afghan people and stressed that they would provide more humanitarian assistance for Afghanistan. The 4 also called on all parties in Afghanistan to realize national reconciliation through substantive dialogue and negotiation, and to build a broader, more inclusive, and united political structure in Afghanistan in the future.
Prior to the meetings in China, Foreign Minister Wang Yi met with top Taliban leaders in Kabul for the first time since the group took power last year. The Taliban agreed to preserve a series of ancient Buddha statues that sit on top of a $1 trillion copper mine. In return, the group wants China's help in turning those metals into hard currency. Beijing hasn't recognized the Taliban government, but has refrained from harshly criticizing its human rights abuses, especially those targeting women. Its recent U-turn on allowing girls to attend high school triggered widespread condemnation. The World Bank has put 4 projects in Afghanistan worth $600 million on hold. And the US has also frozen $7 billion from Afghanistan's central bank. Last week, 41 countries pledged more than $2.4 billion in humanitarian aid, falling short of the United Nations' $4.4 billion appeal.
We count on you to disburse your generous pledges as quickly as possible. We also hope that many of you will exceed the commitments that you have made today, and that you will continue to support the humanitarian response in Afghanistan.
The UN says that around 23 million people are experiencing acute hunger and 10 million children are in urgent need of aid. And despite the additional international aid and China's growing support to Afghanistan, much more will be needed to help rebuild the country's crumbling economy. Hadia Al-Alawi, Straight Talk.
Joining me now to discuss China's interests in Afghanistan from Washington, D.C. is Michael Kugelman. He is the Deputy Director of the Asia Program and Senior Associate for South Asia at the Wilson Center. And from Beijing, Andy Mok, he is a Senior Research Fellow at the Center for China and Globalization. A warm welcome to both, and thanks for joining me on Straight Talk. So, Michael, China's Foreign Minister Wang Yi visited Afghanistan on March 24th, becoming the first Chinese official to visit the country since the Taliban came to power last year. How important was this visit, and was it almost tantamount to recognition of the Afghan government?
It was an important visit, and it follows a pattern of Chinese diplomatic engagement with Taliban leaders that goes back to before the Taliban became a government. I don't know if China is ready to recognize formally the Taliban government. I think it would want to wait until several other countries in the region are ready to recognize it as well. It doesn't want to be the first. That said, China will be cautious, I think, in terms of how it engages in Afghanistan. It will want to receive security assurances. It will want to know that terrorism threats that it is concerned about are being addressed. It will want to see if the Taliban is willing to tackle very specific terrorist threats, such as the TIP, comprised of Uyghur militants. So it will want to engage, but it will also want to be cautious.
So, Andy, is China taking the lead in supporting the Taliban government diplomatically? And what are the, let's say, pillars of Chinese policy towards Afghanistan?
Well, Aisha, I think that it's very noteworthy that two of the greatest humanitarian disasters in recent decades have occurred in the past year. So, one is the conflict in Ukraine, and of course, the other is what's going on in Afghanistan today. And I think China's been consistent that it is for peaceful development and believes that non interference and respect for sovereignty is vital. So, with Afghanistan, as we saw with the precipitous withdrawal by the US, has really created a humanitarian disaster. But it's also, I think, perhaps the beginning of the dawn and the end of this long, dark night that really has been a nightmare for Afghanistan over the last 20 years. And I think China certainly is playing a proactive, and we could even say a leadership role in making sure that the Afghans have a stable, prosperous future, but that the country itself is integrated in a
Yes.
sustainable way to the region and the world at large.
So, how crucial is Afghanistan's mineral wealth to China? And does Afghanistan have the adequate infrastructure required to extract those resources like railway networks, roads, power, and even water?
Yes, Afghanistan has very rich mineral reserves, and they for so long lay unexcavated, unexploited because of warfare, and also because Afghanistan lacks the technology and the capacity and the expertise to get at those minerals. Now, the Taliban is very keen for there to be foreign investment in
Yes.
the country, quite frankly. It would welcome that, but I think again the question is security. The war has ended, but there's a lot of political uncertainty in Afghanistan. There also is very significant terrorist threats, particularly from Islamic State Khorasan. So I think that even before we think about China or any other country being in a position to work with the government in Afghanistan to get at that wealth, that mineral reserves, there'll have to be more assurances of security. China does have an advantage in that it does have some contracts. It has rights to a copper mine near Kabul, so it is in a position to move forward if it
Yes.
were to consider that the security situation was right, and if there are arrangements worked out with the Taliban to do that.
So, Andy, 2 decades ago, it was the Taliban who hindered work with Chinese firms at Mes Aynak, a major copper mine, and that is also home to 2,000-year-old Buddhist relics. Now they want to protect this area. So, how was China able to get the Taliban to agree to such terms?
Well, I think this remains to be seen, Aisha, and this is the big question mark. But I think we also need to recognize that while Afghanistan has tremendous mineral reserves, it's also a desperately poor country with something like 20 billion GDP, 500 US dollar per capita. So it really needs a lot of help. And here, China can not only provide the
No.
technology and the expertise in terms of infrastructure, but also some of the financial support. But clearly, strengthening governance is going to be vital. And I think China can also play a role here as well.
So, Michael, how do you think other neighboring countries are taking part in this effort to help the Afghan government? Are they comfortable with supporting the Taliban government and, of course, with China's role? Are they on board?
Well, I think there's a small number of countries in the region that would support these efforts. Pakistan, for one, I would argue, has been leading the effort to try to get the world to engage more directly with the Taliban government and even to provide financial support directly to the Taliban. Most countries, or really all countries in the West, don't want to do that and have restricted their support largely to humanitarian support. But I would argue that even in the region, it's mainly been humanitarian assistance. And recently, the Organization of Islamic Cooperation came up with a plan to develop a new humanitarian fund to bring more funds into Afghanistan. So I think at this point, the immediate goal is the humanitarian crisis, which is incredibly acute, as we all know. So it may be putting the cart before the horse to be talking about some of these broader investments and development assistance to Afghanistan at a moment when the country's immediate need is humanitarian support.
So, Andy, given the tensions the U.S. and China have seen over the years, it was a rare sight to see U.S. officials meeting with their Chinese counterparts to discuss such a sensitive issue for the United States. So, is the U.S., by joining these Chinese-led talks, signaling that it accepts Beijing will be the dominant player in determining the future of Afghanistan?
Well, I'm not sure that the US would accept China being the dominant player, but certainly I think this is cause for optimism that there's recognition by the US that despite differences in trade and perhaps some other areas, that it is vitally important to work with China and Russia as well. So this tripartite plus talks are proceeding in parallel. But I want to point out too that Iran, Pakistan, Russia, uh, and China are the key countries. There's some of the couple other stands as well are participating in these talks. That the humanitarian assistance, of course, is vital and urgent, but these longer term development initiatives can proceed in parallel. And these are not mutually exclusive. And I think this is important to point out. And again, to strike a note of optimism here,
Yes.
that these four key countries actually share an alignment in worldview as well as the common interest in a stable and prosperous Afghanistan.
It seems like the US's chaotic withdrawal from Afghanistan pushed these countries to take the matter at their hands and solve their problems within themselves. So, Michael, is China seizing Russia's attack on Ukraine as an opportunity to expand its influence in Afghanistan and with other regional countries, of course, while most of the world is distracted?
Well, I mean, I think that China would be interested in engaging with Afghanistan no matter what Russia is doing, though certainly Russia is, I think, one of the few countries that would be willing to work with China in Afghanistan along with Pakistan. But I do think that given that Russia will likely be dealing with some very significant economic stress for a long time, that will advantage China and put it in a position, I think, to potentially be a leader, if it's prepared for that, in engaging more in Afghanistan, not only in Afghanistan, but also in the broader Central Asian space. And that has been an area where we could envision some competition between China and Russia for influence there. But with Russia bogged down in its war, that does give Beijing an advantage potentially.
All right, gentlemen. Unfortunately, we'll have to end it here. Thank you very much for joining me on Straight Talk.